Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well. Let's take a look at some pharmaceutical companies. First of all, a quick disclaimer. I don't work in finance. This is not financial advice. So if you're unsure about your personal finance, please go and contact a qualified advisor. Second, this is not medical advice. So we're going to touch on some different medical conditions and some drugs that are used for them. This is not an endorsement or recommendation to take any of these. If you have medical issues, please talk to your doctor. All right. Second, I am not trustworthy when speaking about any of these companies: Sanofi, GSK, J&J, and Roche. All right, let's get right into it. So before we start scoring any of these companies, let's take a quick look at how the industry actually works. How do these companies make their money? Nowadays, it mostly comes down to having exclusive rights or a monopoly, so to say, on a modern drug. How does that work? First option, you develop a drug yourself, you get it patented, and then you can sell it, or you just buy a company that has developed a drug or is in the process of developing a drug that's promising. So then you own it, obviously, or you buy a license or collaborate with another company that has one such drug. Why? As long as the patent protection lasts, you will be able to sell that drug exclusively, and you can ask for pretty good prices, and you will have high margins. And if you manage to get a drug that a lot of people need, then you will have a lot of revenue from it, and with really good margins, which means you will make a lot of profit. Until the patent protection runs out, of course, at which point your market will be flooded with generics because they all want a piece of your juicy market, obviously. So now that your protection has run out, you might want to develop a new one. So how does that actually work? And yes, you might have seen a slide like this before. Obviously, the process isn't that easy. First of all, finding some kind of target that has use for treatment of patients, that is not a trivial matter, and finding active compounds isn't either. Usually you would start out with tens of thousands of different candidates, and before you actually get to preclinical trials like in vitro experiments, you will have narrowed it down to just a few dozens. And once you get into actual human studies, you will have only like 2 to 5, like a quite small number of them. And it might or still be the case that all of them fail, and you will have no approved product in the end. But if you're lucky, in the end you will have one that is actually approved and you can commercialize, and this is the one that will actually make you money. And at this point you will have spent over 10 years developing and pretty much just spending and not earning any money at all. But despite these challenges, the pharmaceutical industry is actually doing quite well, I would say. These are the numbers, revenue numbers of all of the companies that we're going to score, and a few additional ones that are not on the list, really. That's the gray ones in the bottom, but they are relevant for overall revenue. So I just added up all of the revenue numbers and pulled a growth rate from them essentially. And as you can see, in the last 8 years, you have an average year-over-year growth of about 5.2% for the entire industry, which is not bad. Obviously, there is COVID in 2021, which will have an impact. If you exclude that, you will be at 3.4, which is still a nicely growing industry as a whole. Just to be clear, when I talk about size, I always mean market cap. In this case, having a big market cap doesn't mean you have to have the most revenue. Actually, the three biggest revenue companies on this list are J&J, Roche, and Pfizer. And Pfizer and Roche are quite a bit in the middle of the list, whereas companies like Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk are quite a bit higher. That's because they are valued higher. Doesn't mean they have, like from a revenue perspective, they're not as big as the other two. Just a thing to keep in mind. All right. Now let's take a look at some of the contenders in this list. We will start from smallest and end up with the biggest, and the smaller ones in this case would be below 200 billion USD, so it's still quite big, to be honest. The first one, or the smallest one in the list, is Sanofi. It's a French company. And they report 3 different segments. It's pharmaceuticals, that would be your classic like pharmaceutical company market segment, and it makes up 69% of their overall revenue. And then they also have vaccines, which is what you would expect. It's their vaccine business. That's a traditional branch of them. And they have consumer healthcare, so that's still, in essence, these are still like drugs, but not the kind of like high margin drugs. It's like old stuff, allergy, cough and cold, digestive, and so on. Interestingly, if you look at the bottom there, just looking at revenue, operating income, and operating margins, they're all pretty close to each other, interestingly, like regarding operating margins. Quite interesting. So if you look into their pharmaceutical segment, you will see that there's one drug that kind of sticks out, which is Dupixent or dupilumab. That is a monoclonal interleukin-4 inhibitor, and it's used for atopic dermatitis and asthma. And it's a fairly recent one, so their patents expire like in the 2030s. Yeah, so it's probably going to be protected until then. But it's actually not, like the patents are not held by Sanofi themselves, it's held by Regeneron, and they have, it seems to be a collaboration on this one. Yeah, so this thing makes up about 20% of their pharmaceuticals revenue. Where does their revenue come from? It's mostly like the biggest figure is US, and you will see that is pretty common. It's 38%, then 26% Europe. Yeah, and the rest is just smaller change, so to say. So second on the list is Amgen. It's a US company, and it's sometimes considered a biotech, but the transition is a little bit blurry. It basically works like a pharmaceutical company, and it has one single segment. It's human therapeutics, as you would expect. That's their pharmaceuticals, and this graph on the right is directly taken from their annual report, and it shows that about 20% of their revenue comes from Enbrel. So Enbrel is quite an old drug, to be honest. It's an TNF-alpha inhibitor, so an immunosuppressant, and it was first approved over 30 years ago. The biosimilars of this are available outside the US, but they still retain some degree of protection on it within the US due to more recent patents. So this is one of these cases where you're essentially doing this evergreening thing where you try to extend the protection as much as possible by newer kinds of patents that also protect it in some way and try to avoid competition from taking hold. Unsurprisingly, due to their best product being not protected outside the US does make up the lion's share of their revenue when it comes to the region where it comes from. All right. Then we have Bristol Myers Squibb Company. Also a US company, also just a single segment, that's pharmaceuticals. And yeah, they have a lot of stuff, but as you may see on the right in this little donut, there are three drugs that really stick out, and that's Revlimid, Eliquis, and Opdivo. And these together, they make up about 67% of their total revenue. So that's 2/3 of their revenue coming from these three things. So the first one, Revlimid, the biggest one, is used for multiple myeloma. So it's a cancer drug in a way. And the protection will probably run out in 26, so that's 3 years from now. Eliquis is an anticoagulant, will run out a year later, and Opdivo, checkpoint inhibitor, so fairly modern substance, but this one will also run out in 28. So interesting thing to note, the three biggest drugs will run out within the next 5 years. Definitely something to note. If you look at where the revenue comes from, it's mostly United States, again 63%, and then 23% from Europe, and then rest of the world and other things. Then there is Novartis, one of the two Swiss giants with a market cap of just under 200 bill. So certainly more a small-ish company than a small company, but yeah, it's what it is. They have two segments. Innovative medicines, that is your standard pharmaceuticals business, and then there is Sandoz, and Sandoz is essentially their generics and biosimilars division. So they have announced that they intend to spin Sandoz off as a separate company. That would see about 18% of their revenue gone. Taking a quick look at the operating margins on the right, you see that in innovative medicines, which is like your high margin monopoly drug business, they have 24%, about 24%, and Sandoz has 16%, as you would expect. So by lobbing off Sandoz, you will have quite a nice increase in overall operating margin, but you will also lose all of that revenue, obviously. Just something to keep in mind. When taking a look at their portfolio, you can see that it is actually quite diverse, I would say. Adding together the three top compounds, you get about 28% of their innovative medicines revenue. The biggest one is Cosentyx, which is a psoriasis drug. It's likely going to be protected until 2026, but it's apparently already facing competition from other compounds that have similar effects but use different mechanisms that are not protected by Novartis. Their revenue comes mostly from Europe. I mean, that's 23%, plus Germany and France, which they report separately. United States makes up about 19%, and yeah, as you can see, it's quite a diverse picture. AstraZeneca is the last one of the smallish companies, with market cap of just over 200 billion. It's a United Kingdom based company, and it has one single segment, that's biopharmaceuticals. On the right, you can see their pharmaceuticals that they own, and it's quite a lot. This list, actually, I had to cut it down a little bit. One thing that one should note when looking at this is one of their biggest positions right now is their COVID vaccine, which is probably going to decrease in relevance over time, but yeah, we'll see. Currently it makes up about 10% of their revenue, and then there is Tagrisso and Farxiga. All of these three combined make up about 32% of their total revenue. Tagrisso is an EGF receptor inhibitor. It's used for non-small cell lung cancer, and it will be protected until the mid-30s, 2030s that is. Yeah, so quite a while to go. And Farxiga is a diabetes drug, and it will be protected until 25 and 27. in different regions. When it comes to the regions where they make their revenue in, obviously, they report it as the Americas, and as it so happens, the United States is part of the Americas, and it makes up 32% of their total revenue. And one thing to note here is that AstraZeneca is actually the first one that has relevant exposure to China when it comes to revenue. It makes up about 16% of their total revenue. All right. Now we get to the bigger ones, the quarter-trillion companies. First one is Pfizer, market cap of, well, $250 billion, and yeah, it's a US company, and it has officially it has two segments, but one of them is not really relevant. The other is biopharma, and that is their pharmaceuticals business. Okay, so first of all, on the right is a list of their most important drugs, and the elephant in the room that we have to address obviously is Comirnaty, because that is their COVID vaccine, and it currently makes up 50% of their revenue, which is a lot. So it is a bit difficult to say what impact all of these COVID products will have in the future. If you just were to ignore them for a while, then there's three big drugs that make up a large part of their revenue. It's Eliquis. We've already seen that with Bristol Myers Squibb, so they own that jointly and market it. And then there's Ibrance and Prevnar. Ibrance is a breast cancer drug and will probably be protected until 27. And Prevnar is actually the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine. So that's going to be protected until 26. And something to note, there's a competing product from GSK. So this is actually like the pneumococcal vaccine is actually kind of a duopoly between Pfizer and GSK. Yeah. So these three make up 40% of their total revenues. If you were to ignore, or if you're using 2020's revenues and not 2021 revenues, which would include the COVID vaccine. The revenue comes mostly from the United States, as you would expect, 37%, and developed Europe, 23%, developed rest of the world, 15%, and then quite a big position in the emerging markets. Now, the second Swiss giant obviously is Roche. Roche is also like a $250 billion market cap, based out of Switzerland, obviously. It reports three different segments. So Roche Pharmaceuticals is basically their pharmaceutical business. And then there's Chugai, which is also a pharmaceutical business in Japan, and Roche owns 62% of it. And there's diagnostics. So this is the first time we have a case where one of these companies actually does something kind of different, or it has a segment that isn't directly involved in the pharmaceutical business, but does something in the medical devices and medical technology area. If you're looking at the distribution, so the pharmaceuticals make up 63%, you could add Chugai to that, and that would add another 12%, and diagnostics currently makes up 25%. Of course, that is propped up a little bit by COVID again, because they sold, they were pretty relevant during the pandemic when it comes to testing. Looking at operating margins, again, pharmaceuticals with 27% is obviously the best. Chugai is also quite good, but the revenue is a lot lower, and diagnostics makes up 18 or 19%, depending on how you round. So what are their biggest drugs from the pharmaceutical side? Ocrevus is one that is somewhat recent. It's an MS drug, and it will be protected until 29. And then there's Perjeta, breast cancer. It will expire shortly, like 23 and 24 in the US. And then there is Actemra, also breast cancer, and that is actually has expired like quite a while ago. Revenue-wise, 50% comes from the US, and then 20% Europe. Switzerland gets its own position, obviously, and yeah, then the rest is just smaller pieces, smaller chunks. Next up is AbbVie, also one of the quarter trillion club, a US company based out of Chicago, and it has one segment that's pharmaceutical products, which is the pharmaceutical business. Okay. One thing that really sticks out for AbbVie is the importance of Humira when it comes to their revenue. It actually makes up 36 or 37% of their total revenue. Everything else is a lot lower. Okay, so I don't want to get too much into this topic, but yeah, Humira is a bit of a contentious issue. It is a bit similar to what we already discussed with Enbrel, but Humira is different in the sense that it is big, and it is really, really, really big. In fact, it is the biggest drug worldwide. When it comes to revenue, it's about $20 billion per year. It's also a TNF-alpha inhibitor, so it's an immunosuppressant. The initial patents did expire in 2016, and outside the US, there are actually generics available now, so you would not necessarily have to use the AbbVie product. You could use others, but not in the US. Because AbbVie still holds a large number of patents. Apparently they have about 160 patents that are involved with Humira in some way, and it is probably going to be protected in some way or another until 2034, and this is regarded as like one of the prime examples for evergreening, which a lot of people think is not something pharmaceutical companies should do. And unsurprisingly, since their biggest product is only protected in the US, most of their revenue is coming from the United States with 77%. The rest is just 23%. Okay, next up is Merck Co., not to be confused with the German Merck. So be careful when looking for numbers and reports, because yeah, it's a bit of a trap. It's a United States, it's a US company. They report 3 segments. 2 of them are relevant. It's pharmaceuticals and animal health. The biggest product that they have is Keytruda. So Keytruda is a checkpoint inhibitor. So that's one of the like really modern cancer drugs, and it will be protected probably until 2028. And it is seeing quite impressive growth, like around like 25% yearly growth. Second largest one is Gardasil. That's actually the HPV vaccine. Will be protected until 28. And Januvia, which is a diabetes drug, and that will probably run out in 26. If you combine these 3, you will end up with just below 60% of Merck's total revenue. Yeah, and just for reference, in the bottom, this is the usual donut graph. So you can see animal health, it's a thing that they have, and it's like 11% of their revenue. It's not all that relevant, but yeah, they have it. And their revenues, again, come mostly out of the United States with 46%. China is, it has some relevance to them with 9%, but yeah, just something to note here. It's, they actually have some revenue from China. All right, and then we're down to the last 3, and that is, first of them, Novo Nordisk. So that is actually a Danish company, and they are heavily involved in diabetes and obesity care. And then they have a rare disease division. If you look at what the ratios are, so diabetes and obesity are 86% of their revenue, and rare diseases is about 14. Concerning margins, both of them are quite good. I mean, 40% on diabetes and 47% on rare diseases is quite impressive, I must say. And yeah, all the numbers here will be in Danish krona, just so you know. So what are the biggest drugs? I would divide that into the new GLP-1 agonists and the rest of the diabetes stuff. So the GLP-1 agonists are quite new. Novo Nordisk did have a very early one of them. That's Victoza, and that one is actually going to expire pretty shortly. But they have a new one, Ozempic. And this one is, as you can see on the right, it's from year to year, it gains about like 50% more revenue. So that's quite crazy. Whereas Victoza is slowly going down. Yeah, so the GLP-1 agonists alone make up about a third or so, like 38% of their total revenue. And then other insulin products, so that would be your like standard human insulin that you use for diabetes, that is about 40%. So these two are a large part of their revenue, but within them they are quite diverse. The GLP-1 are very dependent on a single or like single individual substances, whereas the insulin products are quite diverse. And yeah, then there is other diabetes and obesity care, and the total biopharma that also includes the rare disease stuff, and that's 14% of their revenue. So as I said, and actually like this table on the right is taken directly from their annual report, so they actually make a nice overview of when their stuff expires, which is very, very convenient, so thank you for that. Victoza is going to expire this year, and Ozempic is going to be protected almost for another decade. So yeah, and as you can see, this one is really taking off right now. When it comes to the regions, again, United States is the biggest one, then with 45%. Then you have the European Economic Area, that is 27%, and something to note, China makes up 11%. But yeah, just for completion. Then there's Eli Lilly. Eli Lilly is quite a bit bigger, over 300 billion, a United States company. And they have one segment which is a bit like a mouthful: discovery, development, manufacturing, marketing, and sales of pharmaceutical products. It's just like the usual pharmaceutical business. And one thing to note here is that the COVID antibodies probably aren't going to be a big thing in the future, and they made up quite a large portion of their revenue in 21. And then there's Trulicity as one of their biggest positions, with 23% of their total revenues approximately. And similarly to Novo Nordisk, that this thing Trulicity is a GLP-1 agonist. So again, one of these modern diabetes drugs, and it will be protected until 27. Yeah, and actually just taking a look at, I mean, their portfolio is quite diverse. Diabetes makes up a large chunk of it, 46%. And then they have stuff in different disciplines like oncology, immunology, neuroscience, and COVID-related. So in that context, COVID-related stuff is actually just 15% of their revenue. Like diabetes and oncology makes up the biggest chunks. And revenue by region, again, obviously United States with 59%, and the rest is quite a bit smaller. And there we have him, the biggest of them all, that is Johnson & Johnson, with almost $500 billion market cap. based out of the US, obviously. And yeah, they have three segments: consumer health, pharmaceutical, and medtech, whereby pharmaceutical is their pharmaceutical business, and then consumer health is a bit of like more legacy, I would say, and then they have medtech, which is a whole lot of like prosthetics and valves and whatnot. So kind of similarly to Roche, they have relevant revenues from business areas that are not directly pharmaceutical related, like in the pharmaceutical business. Consumer health, of course, has lower margins, like 8.6%. MedTech is at about 16%, and like their pharmaceutical business, which as always is like the high margin business, at 35%. Yeah. So one thing we have to talk about is that they intend to split off their consumer health segment and make it a separate company. So as I said, like this includes some stuff that are not usually associated with pharmaceutical companies. It's like skin health and beauty, over-the-counter medicines. That is something that Sanofi does, for example. That is okay. But then baby care, oral care, wound care, like that kind of stuff. And they will probably go and have it be in its own company under the name of Kenvu. Yeah, and then all of this revenue will be gone. Looking at their pharmaceutical business, they have three big ones. That's Stelara, an interleukin inhibitor that's used for Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. Will be protected until 25, and Darzalex for multiple myeloma, likely protect until the mid-30s, and Imbruvica, that is in cooperation with AbbVie, yeah, it will be protected until 32. Yeah. When it comes to where their revenue comes from, 50% is US, 25 Europe, yeah, and then some change in other regions. Okay, now that we've seen them all, let's go into the scoring. These are the categories that we'll use to score the individual companies. They may not be perfect, but they will give you a broad overview of which of the companies performs relatively well and which of them perform not so well compared to the others. So category 1 will have two items. The first of them is simply the number of years in the last 5 years that they had positive or better than 0% growth, essentially. And then there is compound annual growth in the last 5 years for revenue. Category 2 will be efficiency in the last 5 years, and that will rely on operating margins and return on assets, which is fair in this case because it's only one industry. And then we'll go category 3, which is essentially the crystal ball gazing. We'll take some analyst estimates for the next 5 years regarding earnings. And category 4 is a bit of a weird one. But in the end, I call it risk of bankruptcy, and it's essentially looking at debt to equity ratios and credit ratings. And I'll show you with the first example how it actually works. So first category, historic revenue. In this case, we have 4 companies that had positive or better than 0% revenue growth in the last 5 years. That is J&J, Merck, AbbVie, and BMY. They are all tied in first position, so they all get rank 1. And then the others will follow. They're also there's some of them with 4 years positive, some with 3, and only one with just 2 years. And they will get the respective ranks. Next. Compound annual growth in the last 5 years. So this is just a percentage, essentially, a percentage figure, and we just rank them highest to lowest, and you'll end up with these ranks. BMY is the best in that regard, and the lowest is Novartis, actually. And yeah, Now we just average all the ranks and put them into this order. And once we've done that, the first half, or the better than average ones, will receive 1 point, and the below average ones will have 1 point subtracted. So pretty much we're really only rewarding being better than average and penalizing being worse than average, with the exception of the best in any one category. That company will get 2 points, and the worst or the bottom of the list in any one category will have 2 points subtracted. In this case, the top of the list is Bristol, and the bottom is made out of Sanofi, and they get points accordingly. And then we just take these and put them into the overall scoring, and that was category 1. Next up, category 2, historic efficiency. So in this case, we're using medians because the idea is that you really don't want to be too influenced by outliers and getting a broad general estimate of like the middle-ish performance in the last 5 years. So I used medians for that. When it comes to operating margins, Novo Nordisk is leading the pack, and the lowest, or the bottom, is made up of AstraZeneca with 12% operating margins. Just for the record, that is like all of them are still like really good. I mean, these are some really good operating margins, even on the lower end. Return on assets. You can see Novo Nordisk again is leading the pack with 27%, which is pretty noteworthy. And then, you can go down. The lowest again in this case is AstraZeneca with just 3.3%. We rank all of them, and actually we have a tie in 6th place. So both of them, J&J and Merck, will both get a point, even though they're 6th and 7th place, but they're tied in 6th place essentially. All right, so we just take these scores, put them into the overall list, and we keep going. Category 3, expected growth. So in this case, I used analyst estimates going forward 5 years from ticker.com and just pulled the compound annual growth of those. And the other source would be Yahoo Finance. They have 5 years earnings growth estimates, and I just averaged them out. And I mean, in general, they tend to not deviate that much. I mean, analyst estimates, I mean, they all work with the same numbers essentially. I'm pretty sure they sometimes copy each other's homework. But we have one discrepant one in here. That's Novo Nordisk with ticker predicting a 14.6% annual growth, and Yahoo predicting 2.8. That's quite the discrepancy, but I'll just average it out and use it like that. The only two that are expected to have negative growth is AbbVie and Pfizer. Pfizer, obviously, because of their current, because of the role that their COVID vaccine is currently playing. Okay, and then we just take the points. Like top of the list in this case was Eli Lilly, and Pfizer is makes up the bottom. All right, and they go into the overall score, and we move on to bankruptcy. So a little bit of explanation. In this case, I just use credit ratings from the 3 big rating firms wherever I could find them. Sometimes they're mentioned in the annual reports. Sometimes you can find them somewhere on the internet. Not all of the firms are rated by every firm. And then each of the ratings have a long-term default risk attached to them, and this is essentially what was used to rank them. I know that for analysts, the short-term risk is nowadays more relevant than long-term, but yeah, in this case, long-term default risk was used. So these are the ratings that I can find on the internet. May not be exhaustive, but gives you a pretty good idea. And yeah, we just average out all the long-term risks and then put them into a ranking. And this is what you end up with. J&J and Roche tied on first place with premium ratings, 0.1% long-term risk of bankruptcy. And yeah, on the lower end you have AbbVie with 1%. Now we take current debt to equity ratios, and this is the ranking that you will get if you just go lowest to highest, and you have Sanofi on top and Amgen on the bottom. If you pull an overall rank for them and give the points, then you will see that J&J and Novo Nordisk are actually tied in first place. And you also have a tie in the bottom with AbbVie and Amgen. So Johnson & Johnson and Novo Nordisk are the winners. And they will get their points in category 4. And now that we have given out all the available points, we only have to add up and rearrange them, and there you have it. Now, it's quite interesting. Novo Nordisk is in the top, obviously, because it won 2 categories. This is basically why the system is set up the way it is. So it very heavily rewards being the best in something, and Novo Nordisk is the best in 2 things. Yeah, then of course, if you look at the winners of respective categories, a lot of them cluster in the top because, I mean, these companies didn't get as big as they are because they're not efficient. So obviously they will perform quite well. Just going through them briefly, Merck and Roche tie the 3rd place, and then we have the 2 cursive script ones, J&J and Eli Lilly, taking the 2nd place. So we have ties in 2nd and 3rd place. And yeah, it's with quite a substantial margin. We have Novo Nordisk at the top, which may be or is, according to these categories and these criteria, the best of all the pharmaceutical companies that we looked at in this ranking. So, if you've made it this far, I admire your tenacity for watching something that was essentially an hour-long PowerPoint presentation with a lot of donut graphs. This is essentially an experiment, just sharing some of the research. If you have something to add or think something should have been done differently or graded differently, please let me know. If you have any other industries that you would like to see looked at in a similar manner, also let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching and see you next time.